Hey guys, today I want to address the claim, the phrase "extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence." It's something that a lot of people say. They say it's because it sounds smart, it sounds cool, and it's something that really gets to me anytime someone says. Because when you think about that statement just a little bit, you find that it's actually shallow. It's demonstrably false. So I hope to explain why the claim extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence is so bad that no one should say it anymore. All right. So I think that there are three levels which you can use to approach this question. You can approach the claim as a scientist. You can approach the claim as an everyday person. And you can approach the claim as a philosopher. And I think that on all three levels, that phrase is flawed. There's no level in which extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So let's start with approaching it as a scientist, because that's the perspective that those who make this claim often assume. They think they're scientists, they're smart, and they do not accept any claims without first investigating it to see if it has any evidence. That's what they claim. And so I want to start by looking at the claim through this perspective to see if it actually holds any water. So, as a scientist, I think that you cannot approach anything without first asking for evidence. You should not accept any claim without first asking for evidence. And apart from that, you should try as much as possible to distance yourself from the claim that you investigate. You should not bring in a priori assumptions to the place to the claim you're trying to investigate. If not, you end up with this kind of circular logic where you have already assumed some things about the claim you're investigating, and therefore you come to conclusions about it. Because the idea that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence already starts with the assumptions that certain claims are extraordinary. And if you claim to be a scientist, you cannot assume that a claim is extraordinary before investigating it. Because if you do this, then you begin to look at different claims, and saying, well, this is extraordinary. It requires, extraordinary evidence for me to accept that claim. But this is not an extraordinary claim, therefore it requires a different level of evidence. I think that as a scientist, all claims require evidence, and you don't get to pick and choose what levels of evidence you should demand before you accept a claim as true. And rather, the correct position as a scientist is to follow the evidence wherever it leads. So you just look at the evidence and try as objectively as possible to follow it wherever it leads, even if it leads to a conclusion that contradicts your previously held beliefs about the world. Therefore, you cannot say, well, even though this evidence leads to a conclusion that violates my beliefs, I'm going to say, well, it's an extraordinary claim, so I'll require a higher level of evidence before I accept it because it contradicts my previously held beliefs. And I think that's where it falls. And even think about the concept of extraordinary in itself. What does extraordinary mean? What does extraordinary mean? Because I think that when people say an extraordinary claim, what they really mean is a claim that does not correspond to our conventional notions of how the world works. So when a claim violates that conventional understanding of the world, we claim it is extraordinary. So for instance, if I said that I have parents, I was born of a mom and a dad, that's an ordinary claim. But if I said I didn't have parents, I dropped from the sky, that's an extraordinary claim. Okay, so in that sense, we can begin to talk about how, there's such a thing as an extraordinary claim. But is there such a thing as extraordinary evidence? Because what would extraordinary evidence look like? You cannot really simply assert that a person must produce extraordinary evidence without trying to describe what extraordinary evidence would look like. I give another example, a much more simple example. I can claim I have a pet cat. Would you believe me if I said so? Would you believe me if I said I had a pet dinosaur? The first one is an ordinary claim because everybody has pet cats, and you're more likely to believe that claim. But if I say I have a pet dinosaur, we understand that the dinosaurs are extinct and they do not exist in the world right now. So therefore, it becomes an extraordinary claim. But what kind of evidence is necessary to prove that I have a pet dinosaur versus the kind of evidence that will be necessary if I am a scientist approaching this question objectively to prove that I have a pet cat? I think that the evidence to prove both cases will be the same. All I need to do is to show that I have a pet cat or to show that I have a pet dinosaur. And either way, I have proved my claim regardless of what I think a priori about the claim. Therefore, all claims require evidence when you approach it from a scientific perspective. I think that the second way that we can approach this question is as a layman, as an everyday man. Because at heart, the claim of extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence is something that we sort of intuitively accept. But like I've demonstrated right now, it is not really a scientific claim because from a perspective of science, all claims should require evidence, and we should follow the evidence wherever it leads without bringing a priori assumptions to the table. So then, as a layman, though, I think that this necessarily is not the case, and that's why it's ironic. It's ironic because those people who claim to be scientists, those people who claim to come from a critical scientific perspective, are now using a phrase that in itself is not scientific. But then, it is something that a layman will do, and I believe in heuristic. I call it a heuristic. It's a simple rule of thumb by which you can approach the universe. And I think that heuristics are valid. They are things that I endorse, even though most people don't endorse them. I think that simple rules of thumb for explaining the world around us are really rational ways to approach the world. But then, even from a layman's perspective, when you interrogate the claim, it really does not hold water. Because it's true. If I told you I had a pet cat, you would probably believe me. If I told you I had parents, you'd probably believe me. Those are ordinary claims. But if I told you that I didn't have parents or I had a pet dinosaur, you'd ask me for evidence to show that these things were true. But you see, and so it is certainly true that the more extraordinary the claim on a normal day, as an everyday person, we are more likely to ask for more evidence. But you see that it is actually the flip of the claim that is true. I didn't ask you for evidence when you told me you had parents. I didn't ask you for evidence when you told me you had a cat. I assume that is true. The underlying reasoning for this is that we understand that we cannot always provide evidence for everything we see in the world. We cannot always provide evidence for every claim. If I came home and I told you about my day, I told you about my boss or about a stranger that was rude to me on the road, you don't ask me for evidence for that because it's impossible to provide evidence for everything. So we reserve, as lay people, we reserve asking for evidence for those things that we think violate our understanding of the world. And so the flip claim is true. It is not that for the layman, extraordinary claims require evidence. For the layman, it is actually that ordinary claims require no evidence. Okay? So when you make an ordinary claim, if you're not approaching it from a scientific perspective, if you're approaching it from an everyday perspective, when you make an ordinary claim, then we do not ask you to provide evidence for it. But if you make an extraordinary claim, that is when we ask for evidence. And even then, we do not ask for extraordinary evidence because there's no such thing as extraordinary evidence. That phrase is a nonsensical term. We only ask for evidence, adequate evidence, in the same way that we would ask for evidence in everyday life. Then finally, I think the last way we can approach it is from a philosophical perspective. The phrase extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence is a claim in itself. And I think that this is a bit technical, but I think it's true. It is a claim in itself that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Then the question then becomes, is that claim an extraordinary claim in itself, or is it an ordinary claim? What makes it an ordinary claim versus an extraordinary claim? And if I've shown up to this point that it is not true from the everyday perspective, and it is not true from the scientific perspective, then I think that it's an extraordinary claim. But regardless of that, it becomes murky. It becomes murky. We cannot tell if it's an ordinary claim or if it's an extraordinary claim. And then the question becomes: is there evidence for a claim, for that claim? Because I do not think it's possible to provide evidence for that claim in itself, and so it defeats its own self because it cannot then be held as true. Because if extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, or even that ordinary claims require ordinary evidence, and we cannot provide evidence for this claim as it stands on its own, because it's a claim that really does not subject itself to evidence, then we must hold the claim to be false and reject it in the first place. So thank you very much. I think that nobody should make this argument again. Extraordinary claims do not require extraordinary evidence. Extraordinary claims simply require evidence. Everything requires evidence, and we then have to follow the evidence where it leads. We then have to follow the evidence where it leads. Thank you very much.